So as you have your console service URL provided, right? So this is where your registrations would happen, and ideally, this console services, HashiCorp console services, are deployed on all of your regions wherever you have your subscription resources created, right? Let's say if you have a subscription with Central US, all of your non-prod environments pinned up in Central US, so you would have the console deployed to your central US, and then you would find something called something like a console service default AP central.az AZ stage, whatever the domain name that they're giving, right? And then followed by your identifying your URL with the ask ID. That's how usually is ended up, right? So what makes this difference is because the console is where you would register all of your services via grid, right? So when you've shown the picture where the heads MCG is trying to connect to the grid service, right? So grid gateway, you have the grid gateway nodes running, and the grid gateway nodes indeed resolve the service that is registered here on the console, right? So you have grid gateway is also another service, like it's a service that is running on that region. You would have some nodes running for you, and this would be your kind of a load balancer at a region level, right? So for central, like this would be your own service grid load balancer. I'll give you the URL as well, and all the other services that you really want to expose to via grid are registered as a service on the console. So this is the example file. This is a Terraform file that they have provided for us. So this has a required providers, HashiCorp, console, and Vault. And then this is the where their providers are actually defined. So they have a Azure Stage Central and Azure Stage East as alias, and then the address is something that they would be providing something like this, right? So if it is central region, you'll be provided with this, and the east is something they would be provided with this template, right? And then coming to the resources, whenever you're trying to register a resource, like let's say a node or an API, right? So ideally, node is just a placeholder. So if I go here, so node is kind of a like a let's say you have all of your APIs. You want to segregate your APIs into one category, right? So nodes can be treated in such a way, like all of your APIs, you can create a node and then have all your services registered on that node, right? Let's say for us, we plan to have all our AKS clusters on a specific region. Created under a specific node, and all the services under that are tagged under that node, right? So that's how you would usually maintain a node as per what we have understanding from what they provided, right? And then there comes the actual console service, right? Service is kind of any application that you're registering via grid. If it is the HTTP or HTTPS or some protocols that grid supports as a HF4 proxy, those can be registered as a service indeed, right? So, for example, like services running on your AKS, you could register any Databricks endpoints and anything that any transactions that would happen via HTTPS or HTTP protocols. Those can be registered on a as a service here, right? So this how the definition would like. You would provide a service name, and then you would pick the provider from what region that you are trying to deploy, because this provider is the target where your Terraform would go and deploy on your respective console, right? And I think there should be a ask ID as well provided. What is that? Second. Yeah, I think you're gonna target it on a specific subscription, however, so that they know you are targeting here. So we have a.
I think the partition value that you have is that ask right AIDE.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, partition. So this defines to which console it has to go, because they have been publishing the URLs in such a way that these are identified by your AID or the ask ID, right? And then, as you know, the service would have a node selector, and then the IP is your red IP. So if it is AK service that you're deploying, so you're just giving a IP of your service, right? So if I show you an example here. So this is the name that we are giving for that specific service that I'm creating. And then the IP is usually the service IP at an AKS level that you want to hit it, right? Like when you're trying to hit the service or resolve the service, the grid gateway would resolve this service, and then depending on where or the traffic has to be routed is depending on this particular IP address, right? So this is the address that you would give. And then these are recommended to have some health checks. Like if you have an API, ideally they're asking us to like maybe have a health check, like health check something like that. And if it is a resource, Azure resource itself, let's say like a storage account or an AKS that you're trying to connect, you could always try doing a TCP on whatever port it is as a health check, right? For APIs, they suggest to have a health check or health actuator endpoint with a HTTP call or like whatever the endpoint that you're trying to use. And if it is a resource indeed, like an Azure resource indeed, you can always use a TCP with that private IP on or the private link or the private endpoint that you want to use, right? So this how your registration or like this API registration or the service registration would happen. That's the first point where you would have a service registered, and then there is something important here is the tags, right? So if you see, the tags are important because for APIs, the HAProxy mode and the HAProxy path, right? Like this is not an API example, but if I go here, so HAProxy mode and HAProxy paths is where your grid gateway would decide is the matching parameter that grid gateway would decide and route to that service that is deployed, right? So just remember this one. When I go to MCG, I'll tell you how this is being matched, right? And then this is something that we have done for some testing. Like we wanted to see if the MCG thing kind of works or not. You could ignore this one for now, but these three are important, which makes the API call working, right?
So this one we need to create using Terraform in it, or like how did you create this eligibility SVT?
This on Terraform. So you could run from your local machine, like as an individual services, or we kind of went through a GHA pipelines where we had all these Terraforms, like templates, right? Like we just had the resources, etc., and we were deploying things like infra as code.
Okay, and service grid team helped you to provide all these configurations or whatever, like what should be
it's
the
just
name?
straightforward. So this is what we would need. We just need this, and the rest is our own definitions. So this is what we would need for the connectivity and stuff, right? So this is what the provider and stuff is what we would need, and the resource as a node and the service is something that we would be defining and deploying things, right?
I think a small question like how.
So I'll say, right?
Sorry to interrupt. A small question like how did you got the IP here? Like, do we need to manually create and then we have to manage by Terraform or how?
I said it's the red IP. You could do a data source from the Terraform. Let's say you have a resource, right? Let's say if not a service running on your AKS, I have some private endpoint, right? Like if I go to private endpoints, so whenever you create a private endpoint, anything that is within your VNet would come under your grid vicinity, right? Like or grid network, right? So when a private endpoint is created, the private IP that you're going to be using and calling that service would be your red IP, right? And that's the same IP that you're going to be providing here to call or set up that service. So for at the AKS level, the service that you deploy or the service YAMLs that you deploy, and you end up creating an external IP within the VNet, right, or for that service, that would be your red IP
Okay.
for APIs deployed on AKS.
Okay. And that we have to create these services manually here. Then we need to manage Terraform there in the VS Code, or how it should be.
No, everything that you see on console service, this portal is driven through Terraform only. You can't create anything manual on this one. So you have to use this templates to deploy the services there.
Okay.
Even for destroying and updating, you would need to use the same templates. So your option is like you could have separate templates for each of your files, or you could build a GHA pipeline altogether, like how you maintain your IAC for rest of the other resources. You can also like maintain similar way, like a full blown way of maintaining the services as well.
Mm-hmm.
You could what I mean to say is you could have them lingering around as an individual like terraforms, or you could like structurize them and like utilize, because this would be needed for further like these are needed for any further updates and migrations and stuff. So yes.
Okay.
So as I said, like we have a GHA that is that we've been using full blown to deploy the services and stuff. So this would just push it to the console portal. Okay. So any queries so far?
Here maybe that complete Terraform Git repo link once.
Sure. Yeah.
At least it will help, because like I think the one that you were showing is related to Databricks one or something, not the API one, right? Just to have that tags properly, maybe it will be helpful. Thanks.
So.
So once. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah. So Anik, like, correct me if I'm wrong. So basically, once you provision the private AKS cluster, then whatever the AP or whatever the deployment you are doing, for that you have to create the services with the external IP. Once you got the external IP, via that you have to create the Terraform and upload to the console. Once that done, that IP should be
Yes.
goes to the multi-cloud gateway, and from there we are hitting our APIs and we are getting our APIs. Am I right? That is the correct understanding.
So until you said you deploy your service to AKS with external IP and use that IP to register them on the console. Yes.
Yes.
Right. So it's similar to how you have been doing on the Azure APIM, right? Like APIM is the API manager. Now console would be your service manager, right? It could be APIs, it could be other Azure services indeed, right? So console could hold connections or links to any services. It could be APIs, Azure services themselves, right? So just treat this console as your APIM, but it can connect to any Azure services on a private endpoint or a private IP within your subscription, which is tied up with the service grid. Right?
Okay.
Any resource that you could resolve on a private IP within your subscription called or tunneled through service grid.
Okay.
Okay. So next part is now you have your API services exposed or deployed here, the definition deployed here, right? So the next step or like this, we are going from reverse order, right? So you have registered, you deployed your service on AKS, you have registered the service on service grid, and now MCG is what you would do. So you would have a APIM or MCG endpoint registered, right? And on this definition, if I may show you, so you would have like multiple versions that you could define on the MCG, right? Like for a dev version, if I can show here, you're targeting, and there is a host name that you would provide, and now this is where you would give your grid gateway dot service. So all of these services here that you see, right, whatever we registered here, these like if you remember on AKS, within the namespace you could use a pattern to build a service endpoint, right? Like the service name dot namespace with a port number, and you were able to call one API from the other API internal to the AKS, right? So the similar way on the service grid, it is possible to build a service in, right? So how that endpoint looks like is, so for example, this is the endpoint. So this is one of the API we have, and when I hit that directly, I'm getting, it's a get call. I'm getting a response back, right? So look at this service name. So this is the service name we registered via Terraform, followed by identifier. It's as a service dot service, and then followed by your ask ID, and then the rest of the DNS is what they would provide us, right? So for you, if you really want to test your API within Optum network, which again is coming under all your Optum laptops and stuff are coming under service grid network, right, or the Vicinity, you could always register like a service here and then build your own service endpoints. Like this is the name followed by dot service, and then the AIDE, and then the location is what important. You could just frame out a service endpoint or a DNS, something like this, and then followed by a API context path, right? Like if you're giving a if your API is listening on API slash eligibility profiles, you could directly give those endpoint and hit your service on your postman, right? You don't even need to go to the MCG directly, right? So this case is for your APIs. If you really want to skip the MCG, where you do not have APIs called by external users, you do not want to externalize anything, you can go with the service where if you really do not want any authorization, authentication and authorization on the APIs, you could always use this way to call your internal services from one point to the other, right? So that's how that's work, right? And coming back here, so because the grid gateway itself is a service on your service grid altogether. So if you say there is a grid gateway, and make sure this grid gateway is always running with whatever nodes you see, because if this is down, all of your services are down. Literally, this is the one point of failure for your service grid. Okay, so if your grid gateway is down, think that your application or your connectivity from NCG to whatever list of APIs your or the services that you build is completely down. Okay, so grid gateway service AID endpoint, right? And then if I go to my service that I have, okay, routing. So here, if you see, as I mentioned, this HA proxy paths is important because HA proxy path, my Java Spring Boot application, it's listening on the context path API eligibility, right? So on the MCG, I would define the path as API eligibility. So now what happens is when request comes to MCG, which is this endpoint, followed by API slash eligibility, which is 1.0.0 slash API eligibility, would route or send traffic to this grid gateway service that comes to that grid gateway service. And being a HFO proxy, it resolves all of these services registered or listed on this console, right? And then it figures out, depending on the HA proxy path pattern match, and identifies that, yeah, there is a service registered, and this resolves to this red IP, right? And this routes, this grid gateway routes to that uh, private IP, which ideally is your service sitting on AKS, and it's the external IP within the private virtual network, right? So that's how the whole flow from works from here.
Okay.
Okay, and as I said, right, like UHG, I mean, just to debate on this one, Durga, right, like API gateway, if you have seen, this is already resolving the Cloudflare, this the standard pattern, and even the ESRO team has approved this one, right? So all your API stage and API stage USG and API.usg.com, the multi-cloud gateway. These are externalized, or these are the traffic is incoming from Cloudflare only. IP, if I say, so you could just see this IP. So these are coming from the Cloudflare. So first they hit the Cloudflare NATs or the data centers, and then they route to the MCG DNS.
Anik, one question here. Like,
And this is the standard pattern, right, Anik? Like API stage UHC.com?
Yes. As of today, it is, yes.
Right.
So we don't need to use friend, or like, because the app gateway does have the API. This multi-cloud gateway has flexibility for you to route between the regions as well, right? You could always put another target and map it to another region with weightage and stuff.
Right. Yeah.
and we cannot use our own DNS name here, Anik.
Uh, for this one,
Yeah, like,
the API stage optum.com.
if we have as like pbmp hyphen nonprod.optomars.com, should we
You
use?
could you could have a alias created, and just map it to this one.
And how about the TLS certificate, Benafi certificate over here? Any upload happen here for the TLS certificate?
You could. So see, it's similar to how you are doing. It's just you're just creating another hub just to have another domain name, right? So it's similar to how you have Azure App Gateway with Optum DNS and then Optum benefit certificates, right? So you could just create your own application name, the domain name with your application DNS, required DNS, and then have that resolve this canonical name, right? Like API stage USG.com, right? And like obviously that optum.com would have your benefit certificate, the public or the Komodo certified certificate, right? So you could do that, but it's more like you're just creating another hop, just a volume, right?
Okay, and one more question, like public IP, where I can get from the Azure public IP only, or how it should be, like for the DNS name. If
Which
I
from
like if I create a manual DNS name like pbmp hyphen on prod, for that I need an alias name, right?
this you could just do NS lookup for this one, right? Or you see, ideally you're not creating a record, right? You
Okay.
will be creating a canonical name for this,
Okay.
right? So on Azure, sorry, on Consul portal, I hope you would be using the Consul portal for creating those names, right? So when it goes to DNS services, you would give a alias name and the target FUDN, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's fine because like let's do that later. But I mean remapping we done
Sure,
always
sure,
at
sure,
any
Durga.
point of time, right?
Yeah.
So first let's maybe work on this setup, and once everything is done, then we'll think about like remapping that or something.
Sure.
Yeah. So if you see create a alias DNS when you go with this, right? So what it would give you is you can procure your own your own alias name, which would be, let's say, pn hyphen sage.optum.com. Ideally, this should be available for you to use, right? and then the target DNS would be this one,
Okay.
right? So make sure you, because this is external, internal, like it is internet present or externally available. You have to have your scanner name like on both internal and external, and you could just have a CNAME created, and your Venafi certificate would be on this one.
Okay.
And for each environment, Enik, for example, test stage per CTE, for example, if you have 4 environments, do we need to upload 4 OpenAPI specifications and have configurations for each and everything separately, or is there anything available in MCG manage the environments here?
Say the same API, different environments.
Right.
Yeah, so as you assumed, right, like you can always create a version, and
Okay.
usually there is an option for you to. So if you just go back here, yeah, so you just need to like add in another spec, probably the same spec, and like mark it as what environment you want or what version you want, and you can always publish, and this is differentiated by a header called X upstream environment, which has to be provided when you're calling this API paths, because it determines MCG where to route the request. So for example,
similar thing that we are doing for members like EIMP API call, there is extra upstream, environment header.
this is mandatory because this determines, or MCG determines on this value to which definition it has to route.
Okay. But we cannot pass that in the input request to identify whether it is test environment endpoint or stage environment endpoint. It is basically the header. Okay.
Yes. So that's where we asked the service grid team whether they could do something similar like this. But yeah, I mean, for us, at least at endpoint level, taxonomy remains same, right? Like your URLs across the regions or across the environments would remain the same. If you feel like, right? Like let's say you said Golang has a capability to differentiate between what you could send. So for your test, you would just give test slash API eligibility. For dev, you would give dev slash API eligibility. And each of that definition would have the respective names.
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
But,
like the basically will be having that XPath or whatever.
but at the MCG, when you're calling, you still have to send this one that's mandatory because it has to determine which endpoint it has to route to, right? So
correct. Got it. Yeah. I think this is good. Yeah. EIMP, we are doing the same way. EIMP calls.
yeah. So now your Cloudflare ingress or like external API request comes to your grid gateway, reaches, resolves the service here. And again, one more point is the services that you deploy, it has to be parsed, like it has to have that all node parsing, because that's where the grid gateway would say that, okay, the service is healthy, and then route to the respective requests, right? If things are not, or if the services are not healthy, indeed, the grid gateway would won't be resolved and would say it's not found or the service not found. So you need to make sure whatever service you deployed is healthy enough to for the grid gateway to. Another added advantage you wanna, I know this is gonna be a little. Uh, there is a there is a different way. I mean, there is more additional way to get the AKS working for free open lens connectivity. Um, yeah, there is more that we would need to get that setup going. But yeah, even service grid connection, you can have your freelance connect your AKS. As of now, we have the private clusters, right, which you're not able to connect on the freelance or open lens. But with the service grid, we were able to integrate that and test it, and it's the freelance would be able to connect to private clusters as well with the service grid integration.
So how you will be doing that? Like there is a service that you need to deploy explicitly again for this one, and the start one
you
will
would
be.
Yeah, so you have something called AKS API server URL, right? So on a private cluster, whenever a cluster is created, ideally between a public cluster and private cluster, it's just the API server address that is being like made public or private, right? So on public services or sorry, public AKS, this URL is usually internet accessible, and for private, it is always a private endpoint created, right? So this you would create as a service on console, right? And then, so once this is registered, what happens is there's something called this DNS, right? It's a private DNS zone, right? So the additional step what I was trying to say is because this is resolving a private DNS zone, anything within our Optum premises when you resolve this endpoint, right? So ideally, what happens is it usually goes to internet bomb, right? Because this is private endpoint uh, created, but on Azure, whenever the request is coming, it says it doesn't know, right? So what happens is because the Optum from the Optum network, it doesn't know where exactly this has to be routed. So there is a team called Infoblox, right? So Optum networking or the firewall. So this DNS, the private DNS name, along with the API, the complete API URL, right, has to be provided to this Infoblox team to create a mask record, right? So what is a mask record is when I do from my Optum laptop, when I do a NS lookup, because this is not resolving any of because it's a private link connection and it won't be able to, because this would be on the Azure backbone, right? Now what I have to do is from the Infoblox team, I need to create a mask record. So whenever something like this is being resolved from Optum network, either it could be from laptop or anywhere else, it has to resolve. We are asking them to force it and resolve the grid gateway IPs, right? So the grid gateway IPs are ideally the list of IPs that we see, right? So so we are just saying, hey, create a master record for us, and we would list all of these IPs. So whenever that API dot private link dot central US AZP, this domain name is hit along with this, only from Optum network when a NS lookup or a netcat connection is done. So instead of trying to go to the Azure DNS and say, hey, this one is not present because that's usually part of the Azure backbone network and we won't be able to reach from from the internet, right? So what we are saying is, or our Optum firewall and network team say that, hey, create us a mask record, and whenever something is resolved, just force it to resolve these IPs, right? So what happens once that record is in place? It would resolve this IPs, and because the AK services are registered here, like how you are registering the other services or the APIs, it would resolve this host name, like that this one. So FQDN that we are trying here, right? So this tags. So this would resolve this tags, and this resolves this IP privately. And your open lens is usually all. It's just not the open lens, right? The free lens and open lens. These are just making API calls to your cluster, this to this server, and then getting all the information. They are not connecting to the Azure resource in the backend. For public cluster or private cluster, it's just the API calls that's happening behind the scenes, right? So ideally, now your connectivity to this API is established via service grid from your Optum network, because this is in the private zone and service grid is already tied to your private VNets. Now that API is responding to you, you just need to make some changes on the freelance authentication, and you can get this connectivity going. I can help you. I have a clear documentation of how to and what I could share to you, but it's too early for you. Just have these services registered and tested, and then I can help on the case setup as well.
And a small question, one small question.
Mhm.
To how private AKS cluster will know that it has to be registered to the console via this API server address only. So that what you have said, like API server
Yes.
address, we need to
Yes.
upload to the
So
console.
I'll show example.
Yeah.
I'll show you an example, right? So whenever you're doing a, let's say, let me open my freelance, right? So on the open lens, whenever you're doing a AZ AKS config and like you are pulling the cube config and stuff, right? So what happens behind the scenes is I have this config file. This, yeah. So I have I have this config file, right? And if you ever saw what's there in this config file, it's always a URL, right?
Mm-hmm.
So ideally, it's just the AKS API server URL. That is, we are the OpenLens is calling, authenticating and calling. Authentication is happening this with this token and calling the APIs. So for each operation that you're doing, it's just an API call it is making to the API server, right? AKS API server. So when I say just connect, it authenticates the API, connects, and then it has a out, and then for your deployments and pods behind the scenes, it's just calling. It's just posting the it's just posting the API request, right? So whenever I do, let's say I'm doing a shell, right? So ideally, what happens? It's just posting this command via that API server address, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with the service grid, what makes a difference is we just found out a way because now with the private takers, it's coming under private network, right? Because the clusters are in private network, and we have to only use the AZ command invoke to communicate to the cluster.
Mm-hmm.
Because what the main reason is because the server endpoint, which used to be public, is now made as private link, right? And service grid, what service grid stands for, or what service grid itself is providing is connectivity from the cloud private virtual network to your Optum network, right? It's a hybrid connectivity between two this networks, right? Like from the Optum network to your cloud, which are the subscription, it could be Azure or AWS. Whatever is running on your VNet is accessible via service grid from your Optum laptops or machines or the services, right? And now, because that private endpoint is brought into the vicinity, we just leverage that connectivity, and we were able to just connect. So we if you see this service, we registered that AKS service onto the console, and then we started using it as a server endpoint. If you see the examples here, and then for the regular clusters, it's usually a token that or the certificate or a token that is used to authenticate. What we have been using is because this all of this that you see that's coming under grid services, right? So these are going via a certificate that ARC or the UAG ARC or the service grid team has been overriding, right? So for all of your uh, the service communications that's going out, when I say the services that are registered like this, right? Like I have a service that I registered, right? If I see or show you, it's an HTTPS call, which is a secure call, and if you see, it is secured via this grid gateway, and they are securing via this UGR certificate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which means now it's not the AKS actual Azure certificate that you need. Rather, once you register it as a grid service, it needs that USG grid certificate for authentication, right? So we added certificate authority, the USG grid certificate as authentication, and it kind of started working for us. Right? That's how we got that connectivity established for the private AKS.
Okay. Thanks, Anik.
Yeah, that's one advantage I would say that's coming with the service grid. So anything that is within the virtual network vicinity from Optum network, you always have a way to have that connectivity going.
Yeah, thanks, Inka, to drop because like get all your questions clarified, and Nick, we may bug you again and again. So
Yes.
thank you for your time.
Thanks for
Thank you
your
so
time,
much.
Anik.
Okay, ready.
Thank you.
Thank you.